Hey everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Outdoor Hospitality Weekly, sponsored by Roll Campgrounds and Investor Campfire. This is your go-to show for all things outdoor hospitality, and as always, I am joined by Matt Whittemore and Adam El-Sergani. We're all from Roll Campgrounds, and today we are going to be diving into what is our promised conversation, part two from last week. And if you haven't seen last week's episode or you missed that part one of that conversation, be sure to check us out wherever you get your podcast. And we've also got YouTube if you want to see all of us on camera, although I don't know if the camera shots are really worth it at this point, guys. I think the information is what's key here. But today we're going to dive and go, real high level into really the other side of the equation. So last week we touched on supply and demand, really a 1,000-foot macro view of the industry. And today we're going to talk about sort of the nitty gritty of these parks, really how you make your money and what the expenses look like at the park in the profile. So I think, guys, what I'll sort of tee this up to begin the conversation. And I think for a lot of people on its face, this question is going to sound incredibly basic, but there's a lot of nuance in it that we'll discuss, right? But how does a campground typically make its money, and sort of, how do we look at all the options that are available? I guess let's start with sort of the most basic part of this, which is your campsites. But even within that, right, there are a number of different types of campsites that we look at. So why don't we kick things off and touch on that?
Yeah, so I think, go ahead, Matt.
Go ahead, Adam.
Well, Matt and I both last week went off a little bit on the fact that campgrounds aren't just a real estate operation. They're also a people operation. But I think getting occupancy is very much a people business, and maintaining occupancy and vibe is a people business. I think in terms of how do you actually look at money making, it's very much a real estate business, right? You might on a basic level think about it in the way that you would think of multifamily units, or sort of like a condo to apartment transition or something, right? So we're in most parks, you're going to have, right, RVers, some of whom will be using 50 amp electrical service, so more power, larger units like Class A's, or like large travel trailers, your 40 to some probably 35-foot travel trailers, larger now travel trailers. Then you're going to have 30 amp service for your smaller, right, like motorhomes, for your smaller trailer units, sometimes for vans and that sort of equipment. You're also going to have what are sometimes called primitive sites, which don't have water or electric at all, or just water and electric sites, as opposed to full hookup sites, which would include black tank, gray tank service. Then many RV parks, all of our parks have tent camping, which itself may include electrical service, potable water, or maybe more primitive. And then what are sometimes called park models, I usually refer to them as rentables, just because there's kind of a broad range of what a park model or rentable unit looks like, meaning everything from cabins to vintage campers or temporary rentable campers. Sometimes parks will have tiny homes or mobile tiny homes on park. And then there are also, right, what some RV parks are going to call like hotel units, right? Like actual available space that just happens to be more like a hotel style unit, but that looks out and has access to sort of natural spaces. So I'm gonna give those categories, but I think Matt has a lot of thoughts on time and how long people stay and that sort of stuff. So
Yeah. No, that's all great info. I think about at the simplest level, there's tent campers, there's RVers, and there's people that are looking for lodging of some sort. I mean, there's among lodging, there's these days endless different types of offerings. But when I think about revenue and I'm looking at a financial statement, I'm usually breaking that out by those types of products and offerings, but also by the amount of time that the site is rented for. So quite simply, it's nightly, weekly, monthly, seasonal, and annual campsite rentals. On top of that, you also have membership parks, which are more rare, interesting model that we'll certainly dive into probably at a later date. But some new creative revenue models coming into the industry, some that have been around for a long time but are getting some attention as of late. So I think there's an important distinction here that I find myself talking to lots of investors and talking about the outdoor hospitality business. Obviously, I always find myself making the same or similar statement that not all RV parks are outdoor hospitality. We've got a whole subset of RV parks, which we call internally as man camps. Usually it's affordable housing, it's transient housing for construction workers, traveling nurses, digital nomads, what have you, people that live in RVs full time. There isn't really a camping flavor to these parks. Some of them are very nice, have amenities, but it's paved roads and concrete pads, and each lot is the perfect size and fenced off, and it's a residence more than it is a hospitality offering. So that is not our world. We rub up against it, and we see the listings, and we know who owns them and all that, but that's not what we're interested in. That's not what we're here to talk about. So I always feel like it's important to make that distinction. And also, quite simply, that on top of that, an RV park is not a mobile home park. I can't tell you how many successful investors, and this isn't a knock on them, but I talk to very accomplished, intelligent people, and constantly having to distinguish what is the difference between a mobile home park and an RV park. So that's a mobile home park is a full-time residence, a manufactured house. I think it's bad nomenclature to call it a mobile home because it's not very mobile. Whereas an RV, and I always reminding people that RV stands for recreational vehicle. And like if you just think about that, and it's fun. Like sometimes I'm scratching my head. We're so deep in this industry that you sometimes gotta take a few steps back and realize other people aren't living this day to day, and they probably don't even think about what RV stands for. So RV is a recreational vehicle, and we're in the business of recreation and outdoor hospitality. So that usually dictates shorter term stays. We do have plenty of seasonal customers and some monthlies and some people that have been in the same site for years, decades even. But it's still a very clear delineation that it's a recreational property. It's a hospitality property.
And yeah, to that end, Matt, I'll piggyback on sort of the last thing that you said there, and then we'll move on and touch on another portion of the revenue piece. I think for a lot of people in their mind, and I was like this at first when I got started in the industry many, many years ago, when you think about this seasonal or annual profile guest at the type of RV park that we have, most people cannot separate that from, oh, you're just renting this like I do my house or like a mobile home type park. And I think the way that, again, you have to think about it is you're offering more than just a place to stay. Typically there's activities, amenities that are included in this seasonal contract. And even on the annual side at these resorts that are, down in Arizona or Florida or, mainly down in the Southeast or out West, like there is still an experience in the community that's being created there that you probably don't have in your apartment building, right? It is very rare that your apartment is going to have the same level of community and bonding and the same sort of outdoor experience that you would in a seasonal or type of customer or in an annual type of customer at an RV park. So if you're having trouble like thinking about that as you're going to look to buy, keep that in mind too, especially when you purchase the property. Like that the recreational part of the stay is what is the difference maker, and what ultimately
Absolutely.
separates you from being a landlord that just collects the check and somebody who has these really great annual customers who stay year after year after year, that have developed and formed the community of the park that you're in. So
sure.
I'll just sort of wanted to add that as that note for people who, I had a really hard time trying to think about that. That is the way to think about it, is we're not collecting checks. We're building a community with
Right.
these long-term guests.
Yeah. It's almost like a seasonal HOA vacation community, which is
Exactly.
what I spent most of my childhood vacationing in, was in southern Maine, little cottage condos
Yep.
that they're modular. There's 400 of them in the community, I believe. They closed the whole thing down for the winter. It's clear in the documentation that it's not permitted to be a full-time residence, that it closes for the winter. And that's closer to what we operate in our Northeast seasonal campgrounds than, say, a man camp that's 2 miles down the road from a power plant that is full of construction workers and will be full of construction workers for the next 3 to 5 years, as long as that project goes on. So there's a lot of real estate investors coming into this space. I think they're probably better suited for the man camp style investment, unless they're really embracing taking on the hospitality aspect of the business, because it's completely married. That's going to influence your occupancy. It's going to influence your customer satisfaction, how long people stay, how often they come back, how many friends they tell about, the property, and you got to come to this awesome campground. They do these awesome events, and so on and so forth. So it's very much all tied together.
And so apart from, charging fees for these nightly, weekly, monthly, annual sort of camping stays, there's another really, I wouldn't say a huge revenue stream by any means, and we can certainly talk about, where this fits into the mix, guys. A campground retail store it's almost like running another little small business within the campground. And Adam, you might know this better than any one of us now, being, on these campgrounds and having to sell wood to people and have those late night calls to, oh my gosh, I ran out of ice. Can you please bring me a bag? So why don't we talk about, guys, again, where does the retail mix fit into how our parks make money, and sort of how we look at that in terms of the piece of the pie as we go to buy these properties?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, how do I put that? I feel like I'm gonna like raise some eyebrows on this one, but I think retail, in my mind, is, unless you're running a fairly large sort of like getaway park, retail tends to be a lower scale income stream. I think a lot of mom and pop shops get that wrong. And I think it's more of an amenity for campers, that they do have ice, they have propane, they have firewood, they maybe have snacks they can buy, like bubbles or little things like bug catchers for the kids, things that help enhance that experience, right? I think it's very different from staying with the kind of man camp comparison, right? Like, I had a buddy who used to work on an oil field, and there was a bar just off the man camp, and there was nothing else for 25 miles, right? So like, and then they just charged, right, $20 a beer all night long. I think that it's a model you could take on if you are in a rural camp, but largely retail is about enhancing guest experiences. The reason I say that is because unless you are running a very large, very busy camp, or unless you have sort of scale power to really connect with your like providers, retail is an all day, everyday experience in a seasonal camp, and it's something that's going to like cost to run. And I think that works for mom and pop camps in particular. But
Because they staff it, right? Their home base is in the store. They can man the operation.
Yeah, 100%. But I do think that said, right, like I'm coming with the cautionary tale about retail off the top, but right, there is this magic element to if you can keep a store open, providing some ice cream to a biker who has like come 50 miles as they come across country and all they want is some like high calorie sweet snack, like let's do this, or like being able to give a beer to a guest and like have them go like, this is what I waited for all year. Like I worked so hard all year to have this moment. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I think for me, I think a lot about retail is what do guests need when they get there? And then also what are the needs that they run into, right? Like I sell surprisingly few sewer hoses, or I think of it as surprisingly few given how often I know that they can go out. But every guest who forgets their sewer hose or has it crack in some way, they break off like part of the plastic, uh, is always grateful that one is there for them on camp. So yeah, I think of I think retail for me is a mint on the pillow, but there's a lot of potential for revenue streams depending on how you approach purchasing and whether or not you live on the camp and how you want to provide that retail space to folks.
Alex, I'd say you've opened up my eyes to what retail can be in our discussions. You know, I come from a real estate background and started off with a couple campgrounds that needed a tremendous amount of work and with a very small team, and there was just so much wood to chop that we neglected the retail experience. We looked at the history of it and we saw 95% of sales were firewood and ice. And so I just made the decision for until we figure out all of the other big items that are overwhelming us to some degree, you know, with construction and development and all those things, let's just sell firewood and ice. And that's fine. But, you know, along the lines of what Adam said, is it's an amenity. You want to have a good retail presence. It does require knowledge and brain damage and investment of time and research and trial and error. You know, if you're not up for it, it'll be a challenge. So yeah, I mean, I think it's an important aspect. It's definitely secondary to site revenue, but every campground you see is a different model. I mean, I've seen plenty of KOAs that have 50% of gross revenue is retail revenue, which I don't think that's an interesting investment opportunity for us because we want to be in the campground business, not in the convenience store business. But there is revenue to get there. I used to operate under the assumption that it was a break even at best and it was just an amenity. But like I said, Alex, you've opened my eyes to, you know, getting people to spend $20 a night when they're there and what impact that can have.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, Matt, like my background obviously is coming from the more Jellystone style experience, and obviously like they do retail really well. It's a real core tenet of that operation. I would say most parks in general, not just Jellystones from my experience, should expect between about 3 to 10% of your overall monies from the campground can be from retail. And that is a very healthy, normal mix where obviously your sites are the core driver of this and retail can be a good addition. But I mean, you consider, 10% on $1 million in revenue, that's $100,000 that your store did, right? So, I mean, that can be a significant amount of revenue. And I think really, it comes to looking at how to do retail customized and with the right mix of products, as Adam alluded to, right? Don't pack your store with junk. It can be full, but make it full of valuable items that enhance your experience. add merchandise like custom stuff. I'm wearing my custom Ojai hoodie today. Have that be your park brand, right? Sell that sort of
Yeah.
merch. Matt's got his Turkey Creek hat on, right? Like all of these sorts of things. It's a core nice product that you can use well after that camping trip has ended. And really, that data supports an average spend of between about $5 to $20 you can expect per night from a guest that you can tack onto their reservation. So if somebody's spending, $50 a night on a nightly RV site and you can tack an extra $10 onto that booking, that's a really powerful driver of revenue that you're doing for, very little additional cost, relatively speaking. Most of your retail products should have a margin of around 30 to 50+%. Sometimes you can get things like firewood if you have a great relationship and you can sell it for a really great margin. But between about that, again, 30 to 50% is a sweet spot for what you can expect. Obviously, things like grocery at the lower end of that spectrum and regular retail items being up towards the middle. But this can be a really powerful tool as far as the revenue mix goes. And sort of along with this, guys, we've begun exploring some other additional ancillary revenue streams as well. Let's just touch on briefly, what this looks like for Roll as a part of our experience and bringing in some of these, I would call them more experiential in a lot of ways. So yeah, let's hit on that for people who might not consider that, oh, wait a minute, I could use this as another way to drive my revenue and really increase that average daily guest spend well beyond the nightly or the weekly stay that somebody has in the park.
Yeah, I think that, right, like as I mentioned, that cautionary statement about retail is that most investors, most people I imagine are like listening to us are not coming in with the capacity of KOA or Jellystone. And so like a realistic perspective on fundamentals first and like ancillary like revenue streams second or, staggered. I have in watching retail and play, right? Like I drove through Colorado a couple of years ago and like saw a jerky store that was attached to an RV park and it was pulling in so much money from people who are not RVers, right? I say that to say that like campgrounds are also their nature spaces often, right? Or their access points to nature and their community spaces like we've been talking about. And so, I think we've been looking at all kinds of activity based, like getting folks to come in. And sometimes that's about getting more RVers, right? For example, right, like having musical events in the communities, right? That not only are an incitement for RVers to choose us over other campgrounds that might be proximal to us, but also an incitement for local folks and area folks to come to enjoy the campground, to be outdoors, to, commune with others. And right, this is one of those opportunities to dive into other opportunities to sell a can of Coke, a bag of chips, whatever, a t-shirt, a Turkey Creek hat, whatever those things are. So I think, events like nature walks, events like, local musicians or musicians passing through are ones we've looked at quite a bit. Yoga retreats. Briefly this summer, I was in touch with a horse therapy person, right? Like all these things that encourage people to come to spend time on the campground and then interact with each other. That's, I think, both about, right, like from a revenue perspective, encouraging people to come in, encouraging people to spend a couple extra bucks, but also from just a human perspective, right? Like what made this the best experience ever and will encourage people to return, which then, yeah, from an investor perspective, encourages revenue down the line. I'm kind of like numbers out on like when that works in what situation. I think that's very much about assessing your moment and when to use those things. But in general, I think right? Like if there's a dead spot and you can encourage for, we were talking about a couple weeks ago, Alex, right? Like we happen to have a dead spot in the season that also crosses with a couple major tractor shows near Geneseo. I think we support, right? Like the Western Illinois Antique Tractor Association, in part because the Western Illinois Antique Tractor Association supports us back, and it's a culture of people who go out and see, um, you know, steam engines and old like farm equipment, who also happen to likely own an RV and are willing to come out for those things.
Yeah, I think it provides an awesome opportunity for campground owners when you explore these ancillary income streams outside of retail and site revenue to really connect with recreational opportunities, equipment rentals, boat rentals, fly fishing rentals, bird watching tours, guided hikes, hiking boots, hiking pants, rain jackets, just all those things that will put the cherry on top of the experience. I do think it's a pretty deep exercise to really nail it. And I think, coming from a world of buying these really deep value add campgrounds, it's probably not, unless you're a big company that has a huge team and you have somebody dedicated to retail experience and somebody dedicated to recreational experiences, you're probably not going to get to it until years into your process of fixing up that campground. But I think it's a tremendous opportunity. That being said, the hospitality world in general, forget outdoor hospitality, is really becoming experiential based. And it's fascinating to see that, people are looking for incredible spaces with cool things to do. Social media, I think, has influenced this a ton, that people want to share those cool experiences with their friends and family and followers. And it just creates a tremendous opportunity for outdoor hospitality operators, because we're already in those beautiful spaces. So if you can rise to the occasion and rise to the demand of the market for those types of things, I think the sky is the limit in terms of potential.
And I'll just touch on one thing that we really didn't get to go into, and maybe we'll cover this on another episode. But as far as an ancillary revenue stream, another thing to just consider as a part of this profile is really any fees you can get. Visitor fees, additional adults on the campsite reservation, locking people's sites. There are all these other things that really we would just consider them as it's an add-on on top of the regular site rental booking. But they can be a tremendous amount of revenue over the course of the season, depending on the type of property you have. So, again, I'm sure we'll cover this, more in depth and sort of when to use them, when not to, at a later date. But I did want to touch on that as just, again, it's another revenue stream. But typically, it's a boring one, right? Like it's fees on a paper that you're charging people for as a part of their regular nightly rental. And then really, guys, we just touched on sort of the three main points of revenue, right? So we've got our site rentals, our retail side of the business, and then all these other ancillary experiential parts. Let's dive in and just briefly, I would say let's keep this high level and give people an opportunity to understand the metrics in which we really measure this revenue and look at the overall health of our campground. And then for any listener out there who wants to dive more in depth, I would encourage you to check out our Investor Campfire page, where we will go more in depth into these sorts of metrics, and we'll be coming out and releasing modules coming soon at a later date. So, Matt, why don't I start with you? Why don't we just give people a sense of, what is an ADR? Some people might have heard many of these terms that we're talking about, sort of just break this down at a very high level.
Yeah, I think it's a hospitality term. ADR stands for average daily rate. I think it's people are becoming more familiar with it with kind of the onslaught of short-term rental investing. So many kind of boutique hoteliers, if you will, in the short-term rental space. There's really two levers. If you can break it down as simply as possible, there's two levers that you can pull and two metrics that you should be on top of. There's occupancy, how many people are coming to your property, how often, and then what rate are you achieving? And that's what the ADR, average daily rate, tells you is what are my sites actually renting for? And then that pretty much brings you to RevPAR, or we see some of these campground companies have converted it to RevPass for revenue per available site. In the hotel industry, it stands for revenue per available room, which that's sort of a combination of ADR and occupancy. So you say, like, if you have a $40 ADR, that means you're getting $40 when your site rents. If you have a 50% occupancy and a $40 ADR, then you have a $20 RevPAR or RevPass.
Right. So, and yeah, that's the thing, right? Figuring out both of those other two metrics will give you the other one. So, like, for everybody out there, this sounds a lot more complicated than it probably actually is.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'll point out too some just broad strokes numbers for people as you begin to think through this. Like, okay, that's great, Alex. Like, I'm going to start to measure this, but what does it mean, and how do I know if my occupancy is performing up to standard? If my ADR is really what it should be? Am I overcharging? Am I undercharging? Here again, this is industry wide, not role specific, but just some good benchmarks that you can begin to think about for your operation. So on the occupancy side, I would say consider an occupancy of around 25 to 30% during the season is a really decent benchmark that you can be hitting. If you're in that range or even slightly below it, like, you're probably at a pretty good spot occupancy wise. When we're talking about your rates, consider between about $30 to $35 as a good average daily rate. Now, if you're a larger resort type property and more of a high class operation, well, of course, your ADR is going to be higher. You might be closer to the $45, $55, $65 a night average for one of these large RV resorts down in Florida or down in the Southeast, right? You're going to be able to command a much higher rate for the type of property you have. And then when you sort of combining all of that together, when we look at our RevPAR number, between even under $10 to over $15, if you're a larger operation, somewhere within that range, you're going to fall at a pretty good statistic. I would say with all of this, though, too, just consider the size of property you have, the mix that you have available, the market in which you're in. All of these things are going to be reflective of the type of numbers that actually will make sense for you and the type of deal you're putting together. There certainly is not a one-size-fits-all approach. And in fact, even internally, when I'm looking at it, there are different benchmarks that I'm using property to property in our portfolio just based on the type of park that they are,
Sure.
the location in which they're in, and really how we're measuring things. But hopefully for everybody out there, you can begin to see these are the metrics that will tell you the overall health of the business and some good benchmarking industry-wide for you to at least establish a baseline as you figure out what works for your property. So, guys, any other thoughts to add on that before we get into the nitty-gritty of expenses?
Yeah, I guess I just want to make that clear for listeners because I think what you said there, Alex, is really important. But some of the reasons those numbers might seem lower than maybe folks who are paying out to stay a night for RVs expect, and maybe some investors might expect, looking at what a nightly like site rental costs, in part is because they're a healthy campground, in order to maintain occupancy, is going to have a mix of not only transient folks, but some folks who are going to be paying weekly, monthly, and those rate adjustments are going to be, like Alex said, adaptive based on location, the type of like climate and season, right? Like the types of like amenities you provide, whether that's septic or, like access to, in, Matt's case in New York, great fly fishing, right? Like, so just things for context there.
Awesome, guys. Let's dive into sort of the other end. Obviously, we just talked about, all right, we've got all this money, it starts pouring in, but obviously there are expenses in this business, and there can be a fairly substantial operating expense with running these parks. Matt, you've taken some time and thought about this, really deeply over the last sort of year and a half. Really, what the operating expenses look like for seasonal campgrounds, and beginning to sort of think about the mix in relation to the revenue, and really what the proper level should be when you start to add all the pieces of the pie up. Can you, again, why don't we just run through things at a high level of what those buckets and pieces are when you look at expense categories, and then maybe we can pick a few out and touch on them in some more detail.
Of course. Yeah, it's a really fascinating conversation for me. And I always stress that every RV park, campground, outdoor hospitality property has a supremely unique business model. And it's, that's not to say that you can't apply some averages and analyze data and get some insight there. But I think that's important to note, that I have investors come to me and say, hey, we'd love your help on, building out this property and running this property. And it's like, they want to send me all the numbers and everything. And it's like, actually, first, I just want to visit the property and get a feel for the property, and just what's the flavor, what's the area like, what are the customers like? And, so there's so much qualitative stuff that goes into this industry that I think people can get really tripped up by focusing way too much on the numbers and the budget and all that. I mean, that being said, we do have to dive in here, and you do have to budget, but I think you need to find the right balance between qualitative and quantitative, and prioritize hospitality and guest experience, because that's the baseline, and then build from there and build your budget around that idea. But, that being said, we use a pretty standard kind of real estate set of line items here. We've got 11 categories that we use: general and administrative, marketing and advertising, credit card processing fees, cable, Wi-Fi and telephone, utilities, water and sewer or septic, depending on what type of infrastructure you have, insurance, property taxes, trash removal, maintenance and repairs, and honestly, probably the most important and the most impactful for last is payroll costs, all in taxes, payroll insurance, payroll fees, and obviously those actual payroll dollars that go to the staff. So that's kind of it in a nutshell and how we look at things.
And so I'll sort of take one of these categories, Matt, and sort of give people a warning, especially when, buying one of these properties early on. When we look at your trash bill, be prepared, especially early on in taking over a property, to spend much more on your trash than you would normally anticipate for a weekly regular servicing of your dumpster or your roll-off or whatever you have on the property.
Yeah.
There is going to be a lot of junk that you find on these properties that is collected over the years. And Matt, I don't know that it's crazy to think about a $50 or even in some extreme cases $100,000 trash bill in the initial cleanup and CapEx.
Yeah.
I mean, it can be crazy.
And we've been there. I mean, I on a small 26-acre property with 70 sites, I spent well over $100,000 on junk out and junk removal. I mean, it's a small, sleepy campground, so the ongoing trash bill is $300 a month. Sometimes we got to get an extra dumpster there for the holiday weekends. But then we have another property that's 151 seasonal RV sites, and we've been battling with waste management there. They increased the prices dramatically and then actually swapped us out for a smaller dumpster than what the sellers had. They had a 10-yard dumpster, and they took it away and replaced it with an 8-yard dumpster and said, sorry, we don't have any 10-yard dumpsters. And I'm like, Waste Management, one of the biggest companies in the world, doesn't have a 10-yard dumpster available for us. And they're crazy. I mean, they've got cameras on the trucks. If they see just a piece of the trash bag hanging over the corner of the dumpster, they bang us with a $250 overage fee. If they have to come back a second time, they charge us with like an extra fuel surcharge and an extra environmental fee. You could have a couple months where you have so many fees that amount to a whole year's worth of trash bill. It's crazy. So yeah, it's you've got your two big behemoths, Republic Services and Waste Management, in that industry, and it's a trade-off because we have some mom and pop options available to us, but their dumpsters are just atrocious. So they're rusty, they have holes in them, and it's a lot of brain damage goes into trash disposal. You wouldn't think so,
Yeah.
but it's a thing.
Yeah.
I would say another sneaky utility, just from my experience, to look at is really, consider cutting cable at your park. Now, again, this is not a one-size-fits-all prescription, and I do not recommend you listen to this and go, oh, okay, like Alex told me to cut cable, I can just go ahead and do it now. You really have to look at the profile at your property and see whether that makes sense based on the type of customer you have. But due to things like Starlink internet and most people being on smart TVs and other things now, it may make sense to look at that as an option, because your cable bill can get quite expensive depending on the type of contract you have, who your supplier is, and really what that looks like. So a really sneaky one that's in there that, as you look at these properties, you might consider cutting to reduce your expense base. Obviously, we all know, as Matt touched on, things like payroll, your electric, your water, like you're not going to be able to get away from some of these things. You can cut and obviously monitor the levels, but it's a expense to run the business. Like there's no way to get around your power. Like you have to have people and staff to run the property, but you might be able to get away with not having cable. So it's one of those things. Again, as you go through due diligence, as you look at these properties, consider that as a part of the mix, and whether that really makes sense. So those are two that are sneaky that most people don't look at from my experience, and they're kind of boring, right? Like trash and cable service. It's like, wow, really? But they can have a big impact on your expenses, and certainly things to budget for and look and see if you can consider cutting.
Yeah, we're really deep into that cable conversation at a couple of properties where ideally we're going to improve, and we're putting a bunch of money into improving the Wi-Fi service. But that's no easy feat. I mean, it takes quite a bit of investment, and it's an iterative process of, we jump into these projects in the off season because that's probably the best time to have contractors crawling all over the property. So we had a bunch of Wi-Fi equipment installed, but go figure, when the trees get filled in the season, that screws with the Wi-Fi service. So our goal is to have good enough Wi-Fi that everyone can stream YouTube TV or Netflix or whatever, and then get rid of the cable, because we have a pretty sizable cable bill. We're not there yet, and just even the discussion of, hey, we're thinking about getting rid of cable, especially our park in Massachusetts. Got some passionate Boston sports fans that if they lose access to the NESN, New England Sports Network, I think it is, and they miss their Red Sox games or their Bruins games or Patriots games or whatever, not going to be happy customers. So it's as when you're looking at a spreadsheet and you're saying, oh, just cut this, it's easy to say that, but you might have some upset customers over something that an investor may think is pretty minor. So yeah, I mean, it's you got to put a lot of thought into these decisions, because they may not be minor to many customers.
Yeah, I think that's a good reason to actually go and visit those spaces, right? Like we get away in Geneseo, without cable, we also have a more transient group in Geneseo, and right, like I probably lose 2 hours a week getting told off by someone who brought Starlink that they really wanted to work, but they've also come to a campground that is very tree filled, which appeals to many of the folks who want to get away, but which also interrupts their Starlink, right? Like, so I think that that question about when and how with the internet and who wants to use what utilities while they're there, right? Digital nomads want internet and don't care about cable bills. Patriots fans have got to have, they don't care what you paid on Sunday, you know?
Yeah. Yep.
Guys, any last closing thoughts on any of these sort of expense categories and things to maybe watch out for as a park owner, of something to look out for as we wrap up the conversation? Go ahead, Matt.
Honestly, I think it comes down to payroll, and it's just so pivotal. We find that, and it brings back to the earlier conversation about hospitality versus transient affordable housing. If you're just running a transient affordable housing trailer park, for lack of a better term, you can have a part-time manager that just keeps their eye on things, walks around the park, reports emergencies, and reminds people to pay their bills. Exactly how like a mobile home park manager would work in a small mobile home park. That doesn't work for hospitality. We find that probably on the very lean end, you can get your total payroll cost, fees, payroll dollars, payroll, and insurance and everything that goes along with it, to like 15% of gross revenue. And there's factors there that play in that if the park is way underperforming, the occupancy is terrible, the rates are super low, you're going to be way, way higher than that 15%. If you're buying a value add park, you might be 20, 25, 30% of gross revenue at payroll until you get to equilibrium, I guess I'll call it. And I think for every park, there's a dollar amount baseline that you just cannot go below. You can't just say, well, my budget's 15%. If half the park leaves, it's not going to be 15% anymore. It's going to be 30% probably, or more. So I think you need to figure out, what are my baseline activities, offerings, events, facilities that need to be monitored? What is my baseline, and how much does it cost me to offer that? That's your payroll, and you better have a way to build your business around that offering, because we're in a people business. There's no, you've got your automated RV parks out there. I think that's going to grow, but that's not, people are looking for an old fashioned getaway where they can connect with other people. They have a friendly staff. They see the staff walking around picking up trash. They see maintenance being done. They see, grounds being upkept, and all the things that make them feel good about where they're at. You need that. I think investors are coming into the space and severely underestimating what kind of payroll is required to run these types of properties. I look at William Gadara's book, Unreasonable Hospitality, and his philosophy that you prioritize your guest experience by first prioritizing your staff. You can't have a happy customer if you don't have a happy staff. The staff needs to feel like they are well compensated for the job they are being asked to do. They need to be bought into the mission. They need to show up for work every day feeling pumped to go offer an awesome hospitality experience. And if you don't have that, you just don't have anything. It's the last few years in this business has been eye-opening in that respect, that it is, yes, a great plot of land, some great scenery, location. There is truth to that. But in the hospitality business, right neck and neck with that philosophy is your staff and your guest experience. And you prioritize the guest experience by prioritizing the staff experience. So payroll directly related there, and probably the first thing you should work to figure out if you're looking to jump into this business.
It's the one everybody knows is there, but nobody likes to actually touch and think about because it's such a high dollar amount. Adam,
Yes.
any other final thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, I want to reiterate Matt's thoughts about happy staff, and sometimes that's, I think, hopefully in the future we'll talk about, right, like models for staff payroll and, right, like work campers as opposed to like seasonal, like paid staff and all that kind of stuff. But I do think that like that culture of the business is super critical, and payroll is a big part of it. I also think to the folks sort of looking to invest, right? Like having a really healthy and like active look at, right, like what are my capital expenditures going in at a camp. This is another reason to always visit a camp you're going to buy, right? Like campground septics, campground like internet. On I think on paper a lot of this looks relatively cheap compared to building like apartment buildings or something, right? Like you think, oh, PVC pipe, it's not that far underground, it's not a thing. But I do think it's probably, as a buyer, as someone going in, looking at the state of and the functionality of that material, it's so critical. There are maybe fewer elements to a campground than there are to a building of a comparable size. But I think making sure those things are always operable for the changing people and the relatively high use they get with those changing people, the access points those people have to your infrastructure really is going to, right, like fundamentally change your operations as well. But none of that, all of that's stuff for another day, and none of it's as big as what Matt actually said there, which is, right, like payroll matters because culture of camp matters, because having people come out every day and be enthusiastic about working with campers in those beautiful spaces is what keeps people coming back year over year.
Adam, I think that's a great note to leave on. All right, everyone. That wraps up our discussion as a part of our campground economics conversation. Obviously, today we touched on the revenue and expense piece. And if you missed, again, as a reminder, last week's episode, that was all on supply and demand at a very high level. You can catch both episodes now out on whatever podcast platform you listen to, or you can always subscribe to us on YouTube. I would encourage you to turn that notification bell on or follow us so you get those automatic downloads every time we publish. We post a new episode every Friday, and we will join you back here next week for another great conversation. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much.